Hello everyone, Babs Money here with a very special episode of Dragatha Christie's Unsolved Mysteries. With everything going on right now, I am not necessarily able to be out on the front lines, but I know it is my duty as someone who does consider myself a YouTuber that I use my platform and my privilege in the right way, and I wanted to do that by shedding some light on just a few of the many cases of police brutality that have occurred just in the last century. I normally don't solicit tips, but if anyone were to want to do that, I ask in lieu of tips for you instead to donate to some of the links I'm going to post below. Links to bail funds across the country, a link to donate to the Black Lives Matter organization, several links that I will add to of lists of Black-owned businesses that you can support, whether it be makeup, clothing, home decor, restaurants, you name it. I'm gonna put whatever I can find down here in the description so that you can support them. And even if you didn't want to tip me, you should still go down there and check out all these links and make a donation or support. I know everyone can't necessarily be out there on the front lines. I know everyone's not made for that. So these are just a few ways that you can support the Black community at this time. With that being said, I'm going to get into the first case. I'm going to be going through these backwards chronologically, so from the most recent case to the least recent. The first case I'm going to discuss is the unlawful shooting and murder of William Chapman II. This shooting occurred in Portsmouth, Virginia on April 22nd, 2015, so just a little over 5 years ago. William Chapman II was an 18-year-old young man who was shot and killed by an officer by the name of Stephen D. Rankin. Mind you, this incident occurred only about 4 years after the death of Kirill Denyakin, who was a Kazakhstan national who was also fatally shot by Officer Rankin. This occurred in 2011, and it was noted that while Denyakin was intoxicated, he was unarmed when Officer Rankin fatally shot him. Now, on the day that Mr. Chapman was shot, Walmart store security called Portsmouth police at about 7:30 in the morning, reporting that a shoplifter was leaving the store. Officer Rankin approached William Chapman II across the parking lot, and according to witnesses, a struggle ensued. Witnesses say that Chapman broke free, but then stepped back towards Rankin, at which point the officer shot him twice, hitting him in the face and chest. An autopsy performed on Chapman would show no evidence of a close-range gunshot, meaning that he had to have been several feet away when Officer Rankin shot him. He was pronounced dead at the scene, and his body was taken to the office of the chief medical examiner, for some reason with his hands cuffed behind his back. And it should be noted that a state toxicology report determined that there were neither drugs nor alcohol in Mr. Chapman's system at the time that he was shot. So now we're going to get into the legal proceedings of this case. The Commonwealth of Virginia's Attorney's Office announced that they were seeking an indictment. On September 3rd, a grand jury indicted Rankin on the charge of first-degree murder and the use of a firearm in commission of a felony. Rankin turned himself into jail and was released on a $75,000 bond. Prosecutors said that Officer Rankin could have indeed used non-lethal force, considering the fact that every witness except for Rankin testified that William Chapman had his hands in the air when he was shot. And when they pointed this out, Rankin's defense stated that he had to shoot him when a stun gun failed to stop him, with Rankin claiming that William charged at him. Which is very interesting because even Gregory Provo, who was the Walmart security guard who called the police to begin with, testified that Chapman never charged at Rankin. Instead, he stood several feet away with his hands up in a boxing style, saying, quote, "Are you going to fucking shoot me?" And this was as he was standing 6 feet away from Rankin, Mr. Provo testified. On August 4th, 2016, almost a year and a half after the shooting, Officer Stephen D. Rankin was found not guilty by a jury of first-degree murder, but was found guilty on the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter, of course. In October of that same year, he received a sentence of 30 months, so about 2.5 years. Officer Rankin was released from the Dillwyn Correctional Center on November 19th, 2018, meaning he only served about the 2 years. The half year was, no, we don't need you to do that. Of course, as so often happens in these cases. My feelings on this case are that it was bullshit in the first place, that the police were called, because, full disclosure, full honesty, I have shoplifted from Walmart several times and have been caught. And I was only threatened to have the police called on me. I was told, if you have stolen a certain amount, we're going to call the police. And it just so happened that I was right under the threshold. Their words, not mine. So I think it's bullshit, because had it been a white person, that wouldn't have happened. It would have pulled them into Asset Protection's office, and what happened to me would have happened to them. If not less than that, they would have got a slap on the wrist. I also think that it's bullshit that he was found not guilty of murder, but of voluntary manslaughter. I suppose some people would say that's better than nothing, and voluntary manslaughter is indeed the crime he committed, technically speaking. But in my eyes, police officer or not, someone had their hands in the air and was unarmed, no threat to you, and you shot them dead, when that would not have happened to a white person. Period. I also think it's bullshit that his body was sent to the medical examiner's office with his hands cuffed behind his back. Why was there a need for that? He was already pronounced dead at the scene. So just the amount of disrespect to cuff this young man's hands behind his back after you've already taken his life. Whether he was convicted or not, I don't care about the time he served. The fact of the matter is, this would not have happened to a white person. But because it was a person of color, in this case a young black man, who had allegedly stolen something, he shot him and thought that that'd be the end of it. And it's just crazy to me that even with the testimony of the security guard who called the police in the first place, that he was still not found guilty of murder. And this leads me to my next case, which is the assault and eventual death of Alicia Thomas. Now, this occurred about 8 years ago on July 22nd, 2012 in Los Angeles. In this case, 50-year-old Officer Mary O'Callahan was called to South Broadway Avenue to help her colleagues detain a 35-year-old mother by the name of Alicia Thomas, who had been taken into custody on suspicion of abandoning her children. By the time Officer O'Callahan arrived at the scene, 2 other officers had already handcuffed Miss Thomas and placed her legs in what is called a hobble device that tied them together. The prosecutor said Miss Thomas was, quote, helpless in the back of that police car, end quote, and simply trying to sit up so she could breathe when the dashboard camera captured Officer O'Callahan, frustrated and trying to fix the hobble, threatened to break Thomas's arm, shoved her in the chest and throat, and kicked her in her stomach and then her groin. She also raised her boot and struck her with it, a fact that her defense later pointed out and said that she never kicked Alicia Thomas, she had only struck her with her boot, because that makes it better. According to court documents, immediately after Officer O'Callahan kicked Miss Thomas, another officer whistled and pointed to a video camera inside the patrol car. So rather than stop the bullshit you know and see before your very eyes is occurring, you're like, hey girl, don't do that. Whether you condone it or not, silence is compliance, and silence is violence at the end of the day. Officer O'Callahan continued to kick Miss Thomas in the groin as the officer tried to get her into the patrol car and shut the door. Thomas began breathing heavily and requested an ambulance, saying, quote, I can't, end quote, before passing out a few minutes later. Another camera from another patrol car captured Officer O'Callahan standing outside the vehicle smoking a cigarette, peering in the window at, I lost a nail, but I don't even care, peering in the window at the suspect and saying, quote, that ain't a good sign, end quote. Not a good sign for her, of course. She didn't give a shit about that woman's life. There was a gap of 30 whole minutes between the time that Miss Thomas requested an ambulance and when police actually called an ambulance. Prosecutors said that they lacked the evidence to charge Mary O'Callahan with involuntary manslaughter. The LA County coroner said that cocaine intoxication was likely a major factor in Thomas's death and said that it was impossible to determine if the struggle had played a role in her death or not. Speaking of which, O'Callahan's attorney, Robert Rico, constantly stated that Thomas's being high on cocaine made her combative and thus made his client's use of force acceptable. He also alleged it originally took 3 sets of handcuffs to detain Thomas. Arguing for probation at the trial, O'Callahan's attorney kept talking about how she served 13 years in the Marine Corps and she was meritoriously promoted to sergeant before spending 18 years as an LA police officer. And the appeals panel said the evidence of Thomas's medical distress would probably not have been excluded at trial either way. The court wrote, quote, that it was especially relevant, whereas here, Thomas's appearance and statements such as "I can't breathe" and "I can't move" would have put a reasonable officer on the scene on notice that Thomas was suffering from some type of medical distress that affected her ability to pose a threat to or resist officers. The panel also found quote-unquote substantial evidence to support the jury's finding of excessive force, including evidence that other officers believed that Officer O'Callahan's conduct went too far. Defense attorneys argued on appeal that the lower court was biased and saw O'Callahan as someone who could do no right, and that they were swayed by, quote, sympathy for the Thomas family and a desire to pander to the rolling cameras, end quote, according to court documents. The appeals panel wrote that there was no evidence in the record to support any of these assertions, and said that the transcript of the hearing reflected a trial court that carefully and judiciously weighed the pros and cons of a very difficult sentencing decision. Lost another nail, oh well. Deputy District Attorney Shannon Presby told the jury that Officer O'Callahan's use of force was unreasonable given that Thomas was both unarmed and was being picked up on suspicion of child abandonment and not a violent crime to begin with. Therefore, she posed little threat to officers. Officer O'Callahan was convicted and sentenced to a maximum of 3 years in jail. The final 20 months of her sentence were suspended, meaning she was due to spend about 16 months in a county jail. District Attorney Jackie Lacey said that she was pleased that the jury agreed with their assessment of the evidence in this case, and that the verdict proved that the criminal justice system works. O'Callahan's attorney Robert Rico continued to insist that her use of force was reasonable due to the fact that Thomas was combative and resisting officers and was over 6 feet tall. Ultimately, the Los Angeles City Council paid $2.5 million to settle a lawsuit brought by Thomas's family. In this case, yet again, I feel that this is just bullshit because a white woman who was accused of abandoning her kids would never be assaulted like that. Not to mention, if a white woman in this situation asked for an ambulance, it would be called immediately. This woman waited half an hour and ended up dying because no one cared about her life because she was a black woman that they thought was high on coke, so they didn't care about her life anyway. I mean, hell, the other officer on the scene, one of the other officers anyway, even tried to give her a heads up instead of stopping her from the bullshit she was doing. I also forgot to mention that she was only convicted of assault. She was not convicted of involuntary manslaughter, only assault, and I think that's bullshit because clearly, I don't care what the coroner says, the struggle had something to do with it. The woman sat there and said that she couldn't breathe and that she couldn't move, and you just whooped her ass, wouldn't call her an ambulance when she asked for one, and then she dies. So you are responsible in some form or fashion. And it really upsets me that justice was not properly served, and I would have to disagree with DA Lacey that this verdict proved that the justice system works. I think it proves that it doesn't work because officers will always get a lighter sentence. She didn't even have to serve the 3 years anyway. She only served 16 months, not even a year and a half. The final case I am going to discuss is the assassination of Steve Biko. This occurred about 43 years ago on September 12th, 1977 in Pretoria, South Africa. Now, for those of you who don't know, Steve Biko was an exceptional and inspirational leader who changed the course of South African history. Born on December 18th, 1946 in Tarkastad, South Africa, Steve Biko was a leading anti-apartheid activist and thinker. Steve was frustrated that the National Union of South African Students and other anti-apartheid groups were dominated by white liberals instead of the black people who were mostly affected by apartheid in the first place. He believed that these liberals were well-intentioned but failed to comprehend the black experience and acted in a paternalistic manner, which I can understand would be very irritating because it's like this parental white savior thing that's just very off-putting, whether that is your intention or not. He developed the view that black people needed to organize independently to avoid white domination, and thus he became a leading figure in the creation of the South African Students Organization, also known as SASO. Biko and his compatriots were inspired by the Black Power movement and developed black consciousness as SASO's official ideology. The movement campaigned for an end to apartheid and the transition of South Africa toward universal suffrage and a socialist economy. Steve believed that black people needed to rid themselves of any sense of racial inferiority, and this was an idea he expressed by popularizing the slogan, "Black is beautiful." Mind you, I didn't know until I did a lot of research about Steve Biko that he was the one who developed black consciousness and the slogan "Black is beautiful," and I think that is so wonderful. But what's not wonderful is what happened to him, so I unfortunately have to get into that now. The government came to see him as a subversive threat and placed him under a banning order in 1973, which severely restricted his activities. However, during this ban, he remained politically active, received anonymous threats, and was detained by state security services on several occasions. He ended up being arrested in August of 1977. At Walmer Police Station, Mr. Biko was kept naked and shackled for 20 whole days before he was transferred to the notorious Sanlam building in Port Elizabeth. The security police there resented the respect that Mr. Biko received from the King Williamstown Security Police. They had heard stories that Steve, during a previous stint in detention, had even fought back and punched Warrant Officer Hating, one of the senior officers in King Williamstown. When he arrived at the Sanlam building, security police told him to remain standing. After a while, he sat down, which is when one of the policemen, Captain Seabird, grabbed him and pulled him back onto his feet. A quote-unquote scuffle ensued, and Steve defended himself. Next thing you know, Steve sustained a massive brain hemorrhage. The cause of his death was not disputed, complications resulting from a brain injury. Steve suffered at least 3 brain lesions, occasioned by the application of force to his head. The injury was suffered between the night of September 6th and the morning of September 7th. In their amnesty application, the police who killed Mr. Biko tried to avoid spelling out what exactly had happened, in the same way that they had during the original Biko inquest in 1977. The details are not fully known, however, they admitted that after Steve had suffered a brain injury, that they had kept him in a standing position. They shackled his hands and feet to the metal grill of the cell door. The police noticed that he was speaking with a slur, but refused to relent and continued with their interrogation. Equally complicit in Steve's murder were 3 doctors involved in the case: the district surgeon, Dr. Ivor Lang, the chief district surgeon, Dr. Benjamin Tucker, and Dr. Colin Hirsch, who was a specialist from Port Elizabeth. On September 7th, the police called in Dr. Lang. Lang could find nothing wrong with Mr. Biko, even though he found him in a daze with a badly swollen face, hands, and feet. Instead, the doctor alleged that Mr. Biko was faking it in some way. Lang's more senior colleague, Dr. Tucker, was called in for his opinion on what should be done. Tucker suggested that Steve be taken to a hospital, but the police strongly objected to this, of course. And Tucker subordinated his Hippocratic oath to their wishes. Lang, even though he was acutely aware of Mr. Biko's condition, recommended that he be driven about 435 miles away to the prison hospital in Pretoria. By September 10th, Steve's condition had deteriorated alarmingly. The following day, September 11th, the police put Steve in the back of a Land Rover and drove him about 13 hours from Port Elizabeth to Pretoria, the whole time naked, manacled, and unconscious. On September 12th, Steve Biko died. In the words of Sidney Kentridge, quote, "a miserable and lonely death on a mat on a stone floor in a prison cell," end quote. The Minister of Justice and the police, Jimmy Kruger, issued a statement that Biko had died from a hunger strike. Addressing a National Party Congress, Kruger proclaimed to laughter, quote, "I am not saddened by Biko's death, and I am not mad. His death leaves me cold," end quote. Kruger's remark and the news of Biko's death reverberated around the world. While there had been deaths in detention before, no one thought that in their savage madness, the security police would kill someone with the stature of Mr. Steve Biko. This case is also bullshit, but also very sad. I think it's horrible that Steve Biko did what he did for black people and for South Africa. And much like Nelson Mandela, he was punished for it to the point where he was beaten to death by prison police and nothing was done about it. It was passed off as a hunger strike. But Biko's work lives on, and his ideals live on, and his beliefs live on, and I think that he was a wonderful, amazing person who died in a tragically brutal way, and it sickens me that his killers were not properly brought to justice. These, like I said, are just 3 of the many, many cases of police brutality that happen all the time, just in the last century. And I wanted to show crimes from different years and crimes that happen from all over. So just to show, from Virginia to LA to South Africa, police brutality against black people happens everywhere, and it needs to stop. We need to end racism now, and we need to get out there and show people that Black lives matter. And as I said at the beginning of this video, the front lines, not everybody is made for them. So again, I have links down in the description of places that you can shop from, links you can donate to, organizations you can donate to, because it's not just about being out there protesting on the front lines, but we need to do something. For example, this video may not mean much to people, but it's my way of using my platform to speak out on this bullshit that's happening and to show my support and say that Black lives matter. And I support all of my black and brown brothers and sisters, and I love you all so very much. This is Babs Money, and I am signing off for now. And just remember, we may have a small victory, but the war is not over. Keep fighting the good fight, and remember, Black lives matter. I love you all.